So the goal of the session is to understand the UK and France's new immigration bills in conversation with each other. So seeing them as two sides of the same coin from two countries whose immigration policies are in response to each other and tend to shape each other. And so with this in mind, we wanted to hold a space to hear about resistance organized at the grassroots level in the two countries to find inspirations, draw lessons, and continue to work towards transnational solidarity and action. We've chosen the week of the 1st of May for the session to anchor ourselves in this context of increasing mass mobilization and strike action in France, in the UK, and across Europe in response to the cost of living crisis, to pension reforms, and to ever-mounting government repression against people on the move, trans people, and other marginalized communities. From chants of Solidarité avec les Sans Papiers, solidarity with undocumented migrants across France on May Day and a transnational strike delegation at Monday's march in Paris, to the migrants' rights are workers' rights banner that was dropped on Westminster Bridge in London on Monday as well. The time seems ripe for this conversation to build off this energy and decades, if not centuries, of transnational solidarity building. So with this all in mind, I'm going to present today's speakers, and I'm going to briefly switch back into French to introduce Anna and Shirin. Anna
Sibley is responsible for research at Gisti. She's been working on migration issues since 2010 and has also worked in the Migré network. Gisti is the French information support group for immigrants, a national association defending the rights of migrants. Gisti is also a member of our forum since its creation. Bashira Benia was exiled from Tunisia 8 years ago, and she's a CSP 75 representative for the 18th district of Paris and an intercultural language mediator. The Coordination 75 des Sans Papiers, CSP 75, is an autonomous Parisian collective for undocumented migrants that has now been working for over 20 years.
Finally, Zoe Bantelman is the legal director at ILPA, which is the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, which represents about 4,000 legal practitioners. And finally, just to present the Crossborder Forum. So the Crossborder Forum is a space for civil society organizations and activists interested in the UK-France-Belgium border to exchange information and expertise on ongoing cross-border migration and asylum issues, and to work towards shared advocacy. Our members range from national migrants' rights organizations like le Gisti or JCWI, which is where I'm based, to local grassroots organizations that provide direct support to people on the move. Okay. And now I'm going to pass over to Anna from le Gisti to kick us off. Thank you.
Merci Francesca. Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to just try to present to you briefly the French context and the state of affairs with regard to the French bill. So I'm going to try to give you a bit of context as well. In my presentation, I'll also try to take into account the fact that we have individuals here from the UK and from Belgium who may not know the French system. So I'm sorry if there are things that maybe our France-based listeners will already know. And you can ask me questions, of course, afterwards. So as you know, probably for the last 30 years or so, we've been witnessing the deterioration of reception conditions and the non-respect of the rights of exiled individuals here in France, with reforms of the Aliens Code every 3 years or so. So this is our CESEDA, CESEDA. Code here in France, and this reform that has been announced is kind of in line with the ongoing logic. So we've seen that there have been a lot of laws that have been organized and introduced over the last few years. So the Pasqua law going right back from 1986, 1993, the Sarkozy laws as well in 2003 and 2006. And now these are being echoed. I'm going to just try to give you a bit of context. So there was a proposed bill in the Council of Ministers, and usually it would go to the National Assembly and the Senate as well. There was a lot of back and forth and a lack of agreement between the various bodies. So usually there has to be an agreement. There was a decision that this was going to be introduced as an accelerated process, but as you probably know, there has been, sorry, there's an echo here. There must be someone with a microphone that hasn't been muted. Sorry, it's disturbing me a bit. I'm just going to pause for a second. Thank you. So there is, as I said, a reform process ongoing with regard to the French pension system. You've probably heard about the demonstrations, etc. And in March 2023, this year, it was announced that this bill was being withdrawn and that there may be several different texts that are going to be sort of broken down. There was an announcement recently by Elizabeth Bourne that there was going to be a new bill that might come up in autumn. So there are measures that I'm going to speak about today that are very much kind of up in the air. They're not yet law. Then they give us indications, quite precise indications, about the way in which the government wishes to move forward in terms of migration. So this bill was presented as a response to what are called, in big inverted commas, the problems of immigration. So things that were very much on the table to be dealt with. We've studied a lot of this actually already in the 10th of November study 2021. We actually had an event here for the Crossborder Forum, and we talked about the various states that are kind of putting forward a crisis situation without giving solutions to this. So we've seen that there are various different examples of people being very much under threat within our various contexts. I think it's very important to understand this because we can see that the French policies are being kind of pushed forward in the context of a discourse or a sort of narrative that are very much scaremongering and against migrants and migratory movements in general. There are a few other characteristics to be aware of. The fact that the government are presenting this as a balanced bill between the human side of things and the need for a harder sort of reinforcement. But I think in the end, we can see that most of the measures are actually repressive measures. So they associate immigration with delinquency. I think it's very important to remember this as we look at this in the context also of the British bill. So this bill has been withdrawn, as I say, for the moment. It may be split down into different texts, and the idea is to look at this in the autumn. The various associations are now looking at this and looking at the various intentions clearly stated by our Minister of the Interior on several occasions, so in the press and in an impact study and the text of the bill itself. I think it's important to remember above all that these are measures that are making people more and more vulnerable, whether or not in terms of the increasing number of barriers set up to accessing the right to residence or the harshening of particular repressive contexts. It's important to look at the idea of protected categories for individuals who have been in France for quite a long time, individuals who have been integrated into French society for perhaps 10, 20 years now, are now being looked at as individuals who may see their right to residence withdrawn. So it's very important to look at the various measures that are contained in this bill. The bill itself looks at all the different stages of a migratory pathway followed by somebody in exile in France. So the different steps, and so we can go back to the entry into France with the various border measures. You probably are aware of some of these. The idea is to actually have coercive fingerprinting brought in, so without the consent of the individuals in question as they arrive in France. This is something that we're very worried about, and it could actually concern quite a lot of individuals entering the country. There's also a lot of checks that may be brought in, and this idea of coercion is key here. There's also another reason to refuse visas for non-French nationals who have been obliged to leave the French territory in the past. And these individuals will find it almost impossible to come back into France. So if there is a previous history of them being forced to leave, it's also important to look at the issue of the numbers being given in terms of individuals arriving, and in terms of also the time frames. There are also individuals who perhaps would have found their residency permit granted in more or less favourable conditions that are now being called into question more. So, for example, extra language requirements, extra requirements in terms of the proof they have to give. There's the CSP, so the multi-annual residence permit, that is now being actually made more difficult to access. There's also a new tool that can be used for authorities to analyze these for students. So students will have to keep demonstrating the real and serious nature of their studies. So these are just a few examples when it comes to this CSP permit. The idea is to make this harder and harder to obtain and to keep up. We've also seen in France the principles and values of the French Republic being kind of held up as something that is a reason for actually not allowing individuals to stay within our territory. It's difficult to actually analyze how these can be demonstrated, of course, and we don't quite know exactly what's on the table at the moment, but I think the big danger here is that there's a possibility, if somebody is deemed not to have respected these values, to actually put consequences in place. So, for example, they may have their permit withdrawn. I think a central point as well of this bill is the notion of being a threat to public order. So this has already been introduced in the Aliens Code, the CESEDA, but this is something that I think is going to be also hardened. So the definition of this idea that somebody is actually going against public order and using this as a reason to withdraw their permit. I'll give you some examples of this. So you can be considered as somebody who is posing a threat to public order if you actually have been perhaps taken into a reception centre or temporarily arrested, even if you're not actually found to be guilty. There are also some categories that are deemed protected categories that are now being potentially undermined. So individuals who have family links, for example, people with a French spouse or a French children, there are now some real question marks over whether or not these individuals will still qualify to be protected, or whether or not it's going to be a lot easier for these individuals to be expelled in the future. There are also stronger convictions for offences now. So 5-year in prison terms, expulsion, even if individuals are convicted just for a period of 2 months. So individuals who have very small prison sentences will be now concerned or feel that this could apply to them. I know this is all quite complex, but I think this legal context is something that is getting more and more complex. I think the idea is to try to make the life of these individuals more and more difficult in inverted commas. So I think we need to look at the so-called human side of this bill that actually raises a lot of questions. So we've had the creation of an additional residency permit for workers. The idea is that we have some sectors of employment where there is a lack of a workforce, so what we deem stretched professions, but I think it's going to be difficult for individuals to actually demonstrate that they've been working for the right amount of time within these sectors if they are undocumented migrants. So I think it's very complex to actually see how these measures are going to be put into practice. Just one last point, or second to last point, is that some of these modifications that are being brought in is linked to actually decentralizing some of the bodies that are working on individuals' protection. So some of these associations or bodies are not going to be actually working within the regions, so within the Ile-de-France, for example, but are going to be now kind of outsourced. There is also a worry over the fact that now there could be just one legal body responsible for actually deciding on certain individual situations when these are being examined in the legal system, and also the waiting periods, once again, in terms of people getting things like work permits, etc., are very much under scrutiny. We are seeing now a system that is already quite harsh being looked at under the microscope to try to make it harder. So there are around 70 amendments that have been already integrated, and we can see that these texts are being made harder and harder. So for example, when it comes to family reunion, this is becoming more and more difficult to even have family members visiting France. We've seen also some of the medical services becoming more and more difficult to access for people who are undocumented. There's a real reduction that we've seen being introduced. There's also some of the access conditions for residence permits, for example, when people are unwell, that have been made more and more complicated, and a lot of issues when it comes to visa issuing, the conditionalities associated. So overall, we've seen that the texts on the table are very harsh. I hope you can still hear me. I know I've got a bit of an issue with my connection. But the real important issues that I wanted to share with you today are all linked to the fact that obstacles, barriers are being made harder and harder to really try to prevent individuals accessing a residency permit. And people are being put in a more and more vulnerable situation in France. This is all based on the fact that we consider people who are from other countries as undesirables, in inverted commas, or individuals that have to remain invisible. I think it's important to look at the objectives and the aims on the table and what particularly the far right parties and representatives are saying. I think there are some really awful ideas that are being bandied around, including quotas, including double legal penalties. Why are people in a vulnerable situation right now when it's something that we've actually looked at as a situation that needs to be improved? So, for example, the workers who are contributing to the economy, even though they are undocumented, the idea is to regularize the situation, but we're not seeing how this is really going to be put into place. I think we're seeing a complete inversion of some of the logic that we would feel would make most sense. So there's a real criminalization, I think, of migrants, and there's also an idea that we're going back to the spirit of the law that was brought in 1984. So the idea that individuals were coming into the country to try to find work, and they were trying to prove that they are integrated, that they've got work, and that they're part of society. The idea is that individuals are able to demonstrate that to actually obtain their permit to stay, but then how can they be expected to remain within that very precarious situation for the time expected of them in order to prove this? It's just not logical. There are other issues also at stake in terms of how they're able to pay their bills, how they're able to contribute to things like fighting climate change, etc., etc. I think there are some real issues that we need to look at, not only immigration, but also all the other things associated with this. I'm sorry that I've maybe spoken a bit too long, and also it was very technical, but there were so many things I wanted to actually touch upon today to understand this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that really clear explanation and analysis of the Projet Loi Asile Immigration. And I'm now going to call on Zoe to talk to us about the British context.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you to JCWI for arranging this Cross-Border Forum session today and allowing me the opportunity to hear from such great colleagues on the panel today. Hearing Anna's presentation on the new bill in France only highlighted to me how united we are in the difficulties that we face in both jurisdictions. Although the French bill appears to be more immigration focused, where ours has quite severe ramifications for asylum, it also highlighted to me perhaps how aggressive the UK is in its punitive policymaking and its hostile environment for migrants. And by migrants, I mean that term in its most encompassing way, to include individuals seeking protection as well. The UK already has English requirements for most of its immigration routes. In a 2016 Immigration Act, the government closed its fist on migrants working, creating criminal offences for both employees and employers working, employers where a person is working without the correct status, and large civil penalties for employers of up to £20,000 per worker. And there's no reprieve for industries with labour shortages. Despite long campaigns from civil society and even an amendment tabled to the last bill that we saw in the UK, the Nationality and Borders Now Act 2022, an amendment to give individuals seeking asylum the right to work was unsuccessful. There's also a similar movement that we see in the UK to use a threat to public order, to crack down on migrants in the last act. That was to disqualify victims of trafficking from protection. We see the same thing in the illegal migration bill. We see the same thing for people facing deportation who have committed criminal offences in the UK. And we also see increasingly strict grounds for refusal for migrants under the immigration rules on the basis of things such as conduct, character, and associations. So that's the similarity in terms of the context between the two jurisdictions. But what's happening in the UK at the moment? Well, the illegal migration bill has been rushed through the House of Commons, which is the democratically elected house in Parliament, without any pre-legislative scrutiny, with second reading taking place only a few days after the bill's introduction, and contrary to some conventions that we have in this country, without any possibility of parliamentarians hearing from experts in the only 12 hours that the bill was debated in committee of the whole House, and with the government introducing 145 or so of its own amendments to the bill in the 5 hours of report stage that we had last week. It's also an extremely difficult political climate because there's a very large majority of the government and Parliament, and that means that it's very difficult to try to introduce any amendments that are likely to be successful in that elected House. The bill will next move to the unelected House in Parliament, the House of Lords, and have its second reading, and we hope that it might be amended there. What does the bill mean for the UK's relationship with France? Maybe it's helpful to cover this point. The illegal migration bill and the Migration and Economic Development Partnership, that's the agreement that the UK has with Rwanda, which is the UK's only published third country removal agreement, are likely to cause further strain on the French side of the border. And they also place, of course, a strain and responsibility in terms of responsibility sharing globally and with the UK's continental neighbours. It's all based on what I would call a tactics of deterrence. So while this bill is done under the guise of stopping the boats, and it's purported to come from a compassionate place following tragic loss of life that we've seen in the Channel, it's wholly uncompassionate in its mechanisms to do so. It actually creates a punitive regime, which it hopes will act as a deterrence, but it offers no solution. For example, it puts forward no safe and legal routes by which a person can seek entry to the UK, including from France, without arriving and claiming asylum within the UK itself. And it intends to offload, at least that's my reading of the bill, almost all of its responsibilities to UNHCR's resettlement mechanisms and criteria. But there's little evidence to suggest that this the tactic of deterrence will be effective. It's perhaps worth recalling that the Rwanda agreement was published a year ago now, and yet people have continued to arrive in the UK. I think the sad truth is that many fleeing persecution don't have the luxury to stop on their way and check the status of the UK's complicated asylum or immigration laws, or even to receive legal advice. So, for example, there were 45,000 people approximately detected arriving by small boats last year in 2022, and 51% were in the 3 months of August, September, and October, which was after the Rwanda agreement was announced, and also after the last bill that we had, which was quite punitive, had passed and come into effect in June. The illegal migration bill has quite grave implications for the UK in terms of its constitutional separation of powers. We're seeing limiting of judicial and parliamentary scrutiny whilst creating expansive powers for the executive. And it also raises concerns regarding compliance with international treaties and the UK's responsibilities, for example, under the Refugee Convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, ECAT. The bill, in fact, starts with a statement that the minister is unable to say that the provisions in the bill are compatible with rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. So it's an express acknowledgement that the bill puts human rights at risk. The bill also, as amended by the government very recently, permits a minister to decide whether to ignore interim measures of the European Court of Human Rights when relating to legal proceedings in which a person is to be removed from the UK. So it places the UK on a collision course with the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights. It might be helpful to expand on some of the more specific technical provisions of the bill and why they're likely to be so problematic for migrants. For most refugees, this bill will be a ban on seeking safety and asylum in the UK. It will block almost anyone who arrives here by means that the Home Office deems irregular from making admissible asylum claims. This includes where people have already arrived in the UK on or after the 7th of March of this year, even though the bill is not yet law, who did not travel directly from a country in which their life and liberty was threatened for a refugee convention reason. This travel directly criterion is likely to impact the vast majority, if not all, refugees arriving in the UK from France. Therefore, access to territorial asylum in the UK is going to be extremely limited. If other countries follow suit, then we will see an end to international refugee protection. And the Nationality and Borders Act, the one that I mentioned that passed and came into force only last June, was already a blow to territorial asylum in the UK. It created a two-tier regime differentiating between rights and entitlements that refugees would have based on their mode of arrival to the UK. So limiting, for example, family reunion, routes to settlement, lengths of permission granted to refugees. So this simply adds onto that. Instead of providing support, protection, refuge to individuals seeking asylum, the UK will instead detain them for 28 days without adequate safeguards for challenge. You won't be able to apply for bail, you won't be able to apply for judicial review except in very limited circumstances, and the remaining protections are unlikely to result in release. So it's almost assured detention for 28 days. Existing safeguards for unaccompanied children, for families, for pregnant women in detention are removed by this piece of legislation. And for victims of trafficking, they will also be denied recovery if they come within those conditions and, for example, didn't travel directly from the country in which they feared persecution for a convention reason. Unaccompanied children, where many hundreds have gone missing in recent months, will also be housed by the Home Office in hotels. The bill also creates a duty for ministers to remove all adults and a power to remove unaccompanied children in certain circumstances, no matter how compelling their claim. So in addition to treating their asylum claim as inadmissible and not considering it, the government will also be under a duty to remove those people. By a recent amendment, the government also wants to create the power to use scientific methods of age assessment to decide whether individuals are adults and to treat them as adults if they refuse to consent to scientific methods of age assessment. So, for example, if a child refuses to consent to a scientific medical procedure, they can be removed as if they were an adult. So it's quite draconian and regressive. Human rights claims will also be declared inadmissible except in very exceptional circumstances, and they won't be decided. What this ultimately means is that the bill will create a large, and we think quite permanent, population of people in the UK who will be left in limbo. Because people's asylum claims and human rights claims won't be decided, the vast majority won't be able to be removed to their own country of nationality. Instead, they will have to be removed to a third country. But you'll recall that I said the only published third country removal agreement that the UK has is with Rwanda. The Refugee Council in the UK has estimated that between 161,000 and 192,000 people in the first 3 years after the bill is enacted, if it is, will be inadmissible and will not be removed. And it's quite unlikely, I think, that Rwanda will be able to accept the hundreds of thousands of people who the bill could only remove to a third country. What this means is that French nationals under the bill could be removed to France, but an Afghan national couldn't be returned to Afghanistan, nor can they be returned to France unless France agrees to accept them. So the only place they can be removed to would be Rwanda or any other country that the UK had a third country removal agreement with. The bill also intends to make it much more difficult for EU nationals to make human rights claims. And so, for example, if a French person in the UK wanted to make a human rights claim as to why they should remain in the UK, the bill would make that inadmissible. The bill will also lock out certain people present in the UK from securing any type of residence or citizenship in the future. And that means that these people will be in the UK undocumented without any way to regularize their status or obtain the right to work or the right to rent. In terms of safe and legal routes, I mentioned that the bill creates none, but what the government does do is give itself the power to create through regulations, which is not a primary piece of legislation, it's a secondary piece of legislation, which nationalities the government can give protection to. So it can decide that there's a cap on the number of people who are allowed to enter the UK through safe and legal routes and say which of the routes are included as safe and legal routes. So uncapped routes that the UK currently has, such as for people who assisted the UK in Afghanistan, could essentially become capped if they were included in these regulations. So there are many reasons why we're extremely concerned about the bill. And that it perpetuates that very thing that Anna was talking about, this unworthy and worthy distinction, with migrants, including refugees, falling on the unworthy side of that distinction in the government's eyes.
Thank you very much, Zoe. That was really brilliant, if a bit disheartening, but that's okay, because our next section will focus on how people have been organising in response. We are quite short on time, so we might not have time to have a full Q&A now, but if there were any pressing questions for Zoe and Anna about the two bills that we've just talked about, please okay, I've got a question here from Anna. Can you tell us a bit more about the agenda of this law? So I think you mean like the schedule, the timeline.
So it's going to have its second reading in the House of Lords on the 10th of May. Then we expect it to have its next stage, maybe the third week of May, report stage very shortly after that. And then what happens is, if the House of Lords amends the bill, something called ping pong takes place, where the bill goes back and forth between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I think we can expect the bill to be passed certainly before the first week or so of July, possibly by the end of June or mid-June.
Thank you, Zoe. Are there any other questions before I? No, okay, great. Thank you to both Zoe and Anna for those presentations. And now I'm really happy to be handing over to Bashira, who will be talking about her experience at CSP 75. Over to you.
Merci. Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Thank you very much.
Les collectifs de Sans Papiers, la CSP 75 avec tous les collectifs.
Since the collective, we've been discussing, especially after COVID, it was a period of mobilization for us that was organized in 3 times. On the 13th of May, during lockdown, and we had about 5,000 people marching in Paris. And then on the 20th of June, we had Act 2 of the undocumented, for undocumented migrants. And then the third act was like very strong. And we walked, we demonstrated everywhere in France.
Sur un axe sud, Marseille, Montpellier, vers Paris, de Lille, Lyon, mais l'objectif, c'était arriver à l'Élysée et revendiquer la régularisation de tous les sans-papiers, la fermeture des CRA et de logements décents. Pourquoi je parle de ces trois actes et de grande mobilisation depuis 2020 surtout, c'est que pour dire que nous attendons, suite à toutes ces mobilisations
So
massives,
after all these massive mobilizations, we saw that there was quite an effect in terms of all the undocumented migrants coming together and really demonstrating. And we have been able to talk recently about the reform of our bill and the fact that there are going to be some, hopefully, some changes that could be in our favour. However, what we've seen recently is that, in fact, against what we actually expected, the idea is that the life of people who are in exile is going to be made more and more difficult. So we can see that there are now amendments coming in to actually try to discourage individuals from staying in France. So we're now really ramping up our work, and we're really trying to see how some of the aspects of this law are being debated, and the way in which we can actually organize ourselves to really try to make our voices heard and really fight against what's on the table right now, to really explain why we are against this bill, why we can try to really come together to raise awareness among individuals within our own local areas, and trying to get to the highest level as well, so the level of parliament, to try to really explain why we're against this bill, saying that what has been announced, even in terms of making undocumented workers' rights legal, we've seen that it's difficult for many workers to obtain the proof that is going to be required that they have been working for the given period. How can we prove that we've been working within the areas in question under this bill if we are undocumented, if we don't have the right papers that is required? So we have to try to raise awareness of this. We're kind of in a trap right now. We're in a no man's land. We're found in limbo because we are going to be required to give documentation to show the fact that we've been working, etc. But because we're undocumented, we don't have these proofs. So we don't have papers to show. That's the whole point of being sans papiers, being undocumented. We've been unable to obtain such documentation. And this has a lot of impacts in terms of childcare, in terms of accessing services, particularly for women who are undocumented. Around half, or maybe more than half, of those undocumented migrants in France that we're talking about are actually women. So how can we consider the vulnerability of this particular group? There's a lot of announcements taking place at the moment in terms of people obtaining legal status, but how can we actually analyze the effects on some of the most vulnerable groups? I think it's important to look at the basis of these possible new laws and how we can actually analyze what's really going to happen in practice and raise awareness of that. So how are we going to be able to organize ourselves with other associations to really try to fight for our rights? We have various collectives with which we're working to actually really create a large mobilization to try to establish links between us, to try to contact MPs and explain exactly why this bill that's on the table is really a threat to us. We have to use facts, concrete facts, to prove what we're saying. We organized a demonstration before the National Assembly recently to actually try to get this message across. We had various associations involved with migrants and exiled individuals here in France who came together to really try to explain exactly why this bill was a further undermining of our rights. We can also talk about some of the organizational aspects that are coming in, and also what we've seen since 2022, the end of 2022, with the collectives that are being further enforced and having more and more people on board. We've seen now that there are now more collectives bringing together different associations, Gisti, CIMAD, various undocumented workers associations to make a national collective effort. We've now got real public meetings being set up to explain why we're against the bill, why it's dangerous, why it's undermining our rights. We're also organising marches now. So we had one on the 23rd of March in Paris. We also had one on the 29th of April to denounce the discriminatory policies and to also denounce some of the operations that have been in the table. We need to continue to ramp up these efforts. We have to raise awareness, we have to come together, and it's important to think about how we can actually strengthen our organization, bring together those who are on the same wavelength. As I said, we are finding ourselves in a little bit of a difficult situation when it comes to really bringing together undocumented migrants, because some individuals don't want to really be in the spotlight, and we're talking about really making these individuals legal. So the announcements that have come in recently have kind of created a sense of hope among undocumented migrants who are kind of waiting for something positive. And I think it's important to try to really raise awareness among these individuals. For example, the language component of some of the new measures that may come in. I think it's important to actually try to stress that this is going to really make it more and more difficult to access the rights to which we should be entitled. I think there's a lot of awareness raising that still needs to be done to try to really shed light on the reality. I think we can draw some good comparisons with what's happening in the UK at the moment. I think there are real points in common in terms of the hardening of policies and in terms of what we've seen on the borders as well, some of the horrors that we've seen. We have comrades in the UK who have been waiting for 2 years or more for a ruling in their asylum cases, and there's a real psychological impact of this, of course. I think we have a lot of individuals that we've heard from that have really paid the price for some of the policies that are being organized in order to try to discourage people from entering or staying in our countries. I think people are now losing hope. People who should be entitled to refugee status are now in a sort of limbo situation and are now seeing that these policies coming in are making them more and more vulnerable. I think there are so many challenges now, and the Caspian-Berger law needs to be looked at as well. This is a law against squats, and there are very severe fines and prison sentences attached to this. There are a lot of our undocumented migrant comrades who have fallen foul of this law because they don't have access to housing, because they don't have access to a way of coming out of their precarious precarious and poor situation. How can we therefore support these individuals? We've been trying to mobilize within our platform to try to support people in facing these challenges. We've been trying to set up different frameworks, working on this. We hope to enlarge these efforts on a national scale because we see that there are many individuals facing the same challenges here and elsewhere. We're facing the same discriminatory policies, and I think it's really important for us to reunite and for us to pool our resources and efforts. We are now observing a real climate of hate and criminalization, and it's important, I think, to note that this is the biggest challenge. We really hope, therefore, that we're going to be able to extend our influence as much as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shira. That was really, really excellent and so interesting. And I'm just really happy that you agreed to come on and speak with us today. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's discussion. And I'm going to abuse my power as host again, just to ask a question for Shira, and ask maybe if you could explain a bit more about the kind of organizing that has taken place, but the collaboration between undocumented migrants collectives and trade unions and other groups who have been fighting against the pension reform in France, because the amount of social movement in response to the pension reform actually caused a delay in the immigration bill to be debated and to be moved on to its next stage. And I think that's a brilliant show of how solidarity across different, segments of the population, or like a broad coalition base, can really lead to that kind of change. And then I will get to questions in the chat.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. So as to the collective of undocumented migrants and the CSP 75, they worked together in the frame of a wider scope of mobilization for the unions and the civil society. It's not something new. CSP 75 already existed in 2006, and they were part of the demonstration for the solidarity, and it is a union. And in the frameworks of other fights, we're working also with the CGT, which is the main union for workers. Today, we are working with the Vetri Collective. It was created in '94, and they've been striking for 17 months to get papers. They are working with a company that is working with the Post, which is the equivalent of Royal Mail. So they've been working for that company, which is La Poste, equivalent of Royal Mail, and they have never received any documents. So they're working with DPD, also another agency working with the French Post, French Royal Mail, and the collective of Vitry are working with Chronopost. So they are supported by Solidaire, and Solidaire is a union. So it is linked. So what I want to say is that there are a lot of undocumented migrants who are parts of unions, and they take part in demonstrations, and a lot of those people who are undocumented are part of union. When I myself was in that situation, I was also part of the CGT, which is the main working union in France. You get protection when you are part of unions. So it is normal when you look at the pension reform and the mobilization, it is normal that you can find some individuals who are undocumented because they are also in the unions. And for the CSP 75, we have some people who have papers now. Now, those people, they have been in CSP for 10 years. But you know, living precariousness is extremely difficult. And by solidarity with other undocumented people, they are demonstrating. We will always need CSP 75 because you can reach us without any appointment. You can lose your leave to remain from one day to another. It's very precarious. So we are always open. We're always accessible. Today at the CSP 75, we have people who are knocking at our door because they've worked for 10 years without any papers. They are undocumented, and now they are impacted by the pension reform. We are workers, and we are working in sectors that are in tension. We know very well that when you're 64, it's not easy for those individuals to have a pension because you've been undocumented, because you've been someone without papers. So it is very challenging, and it is normal that you've got bridges between these people and also with people in the pension reform. So there is a link between the two. We are aware of that, and we try to get mobilized, and we try to be together because we are workers, essential workers, and this bill has an impact and has an impact on people, on foreigners and people who work on very difficult jobs. These jobs are so difficult when you are 64, so they need to be mobilized. I hope that I've answered your question.
Yeah, that was really perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to move to the questions in the chat. So there's a question from Irie, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. And they say, I would be keen to know if the mobilization this time is drawing in different types of associations and groups who were not involved before, and if so, why? And I'm pretty sure this was about mobilization of undocumented migrants in France in response to the new migration bill. So maybe that's a question that Bashira or Anna could take.
But je pense que Bashira a déjà en partie
I think Bashira has answered to that question already, but I will try to maybe add something. For each mobilization, we can see that there are new collectives, new people are joining the different mobilizations. It's obvious, but you've got a grassroots that is common from years, and then you've got new collectives joining. I'm thinking of Asian communities, for example, who's joined us, joined the mobilization recently. So it was not something that was happening before. So maybe Bashira would be able to give you more precisions on that.
Merci Anna. Oui, là vous parlez
Thank
du
you,
collectif.
Anna. Yes, you are talking about the association Asia Solidarity France. It is true. We had Afghan people who joined us because it's not just the bill, but also the amendments that are being studied, the different policies, the next law that we call the Berger for people in squats. We've got lots of different communities, lots of comrades who live in the squats, and every day we realize that we need more mobilization. And maybe in the siege, we've got more than 50 organizations. The biggest challenge for us, undocumented, is to have more collectives of undocumented people. We were more numerous in 2020. There were like many collectives that were created in Marseille, Rennes, Rouen, and with all this narrative on, regular undocumented, it's very difficult to mobilize people in other parts of France. In Paris, we're very well organized, but we really need more collectives for undocumented migrants everywhere in France who could join us.
Thank you very much. The other question that was in the chat, I think, has been answered. There's some links in answer to your question, Jean-Pierre. And yeah, another question for the French side. Can Anna or Bashira please comment on the political left in the Assemblée nationale and or local authorities? Are they trying to challenge the government on this at all?
Oui, je peux essayer de répondre très
Yes, I can try to answer that briefly. I think there is a balance in the Assemblée nationale that is not favorable for the government. So the majority is right, but we've seen some parties on the left wing who stood against this bill. Unfortunately, it is not enough, to change the outcome because the right has the majority. I think it is very important to put this in the context, in the general context. When we talk about the pension reform, it shows that it's very difficult to pass the bills. And I think what is a challenge here also for this specific bill is that there is very few debates. The government wants to pass the bill using the force. They use an accelerated procedure. You know, it's not just for immigration bill. They use that little stunt, you know, like to pass the bill very quickly. They use it more and more, and it makes our work more complex because they use the 49.3 article that you know about, and it shows that using this specific article, you can pass the bill without having the bill voted. So it means that you have less debate, less discussions. But there are some people on the left wing, of course, who are supporting the collectives and supporting the association, but unfortunately, they are not enough. I hope that I've answered your question.
Were there any other questions from, was that a hand from Jean-Pierre? Yeah, feel free to unmute.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. I was wondering, je me demandais si...
I'm just wondering whether, in terms of the parliamentary report from 2021, when it comes to the public money being spent on the border with the UK, I think these numbers have gone up in terms of the amount of money being spent with all the Frontex aircraft after the shipwreck in November 2021. I think it's important to actually underline the importance of the issue of costs in terms of the public purse, and also the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the policies currently being implemented on the border. I think it's important to look at the cost issue and to look at what's being spent in France and in the UK on the borders, and to try to really raise awareness of this and to demonstrate that all this money could be used to better ends for social services, social support, services for individuals who are in a situation of exile. I think I wanted to just know if there are any further figures, specific figures in terms of the monetary costs that are accessible to us, in terms of something really concrete to use as an argument. Unfortunately, I think when it comes to all these issues, it seems rather ineffective to talk in humanitarian terms, particularly when we're looking at trying to convince people on the right. But if we perhaps used cost as an argument, that might be a more effective rationale, perhaps, at least to convince some sections of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've just put in the chat a link to a report which estimates the cost of bilateral agreements between France and the UK since the 90s at 1.3 billion euros. which is an incredible amount of money. And then I'm also going to put in the chat this House of Commons briefing on UK-France collaboration on the shared border, and they have a detail of the amount spent per bilateral agreement. But I don't know if any of the other speakers wanted to come in on that point.
Moi, c'est juste un mot pour dire que...
Yes, I think just one thing from me to say that we can really talk about the economic cost of this as something absolutely absurd. And I think it is largely documented. I think we're talking around about 10 to 15,000 euros per person when it comes to expulsion. So it's crazy money. And I think this is a real argument we can use. So all this about how to maintain somebody in detention, actually expelling an individual, all this is incredibly costly. The other thing I wanted to say here is that something that's often forgotten is that when we're talking about our idea of immigration, we don't want to be utilitarian, but I think we have to say that the individuals in question do contribute quite substantially to the economies of the countries involved. So again, just to confirm what Jean-Pierre says. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's also a new initiative from UK-based organisations called Costility, which I'm trying to find the link to, but failing. Yeah, sorry.
Can I add something from the UK context in response to Jean-Pierre's question? I think it's quite murky waters getting into the discussion of how much it costs, because what happens is the government throws figures at us and we throw figures back at the government. And so, for example, part of what we see in the UK and part of the justification for stopping the boats is it costs the taxpayers X million pounds per day in housing people in hotels. Doesn't deal with the underlying problem with housing in the UK, which the government, neatly avoids through that form of argumentation. But I don't know how helpful it is to fight figures with figures. This has been part of Labour's strategy in the UK in relation to the bill. So in the House of Commons, we've seen that Labour front bench has taken a line that the bill is unworkable, and part of what it's looking at is, the UK will have to support these people, they will have to hold them in detention or house them, accommodate them if we can't send them back to their home countries. And I think maybe that's helpful in terms of their line of the unworkability of it, but there's still also the fact of the large amount that would be spent accommodating people. I think what we say is that the bill, instead of using these punitive provisions in the bill, what the government could do is not make people inadmissible, but instead create more efficient processes to bring people through the asylum system more quickly and decide on their claims. And if they do have a human rights or an asylum claim, which the government or the courts ultimately determine is valid and should be accepted, then they should then be given they will no longer need to rely on the public purse, because they will have the right to work under existing legislation, and all the better if we give them the right to work earlier so that they can contribute and be included in British society. So I'm not sure how effective it is in terms of argumentation to fight figures with figures. I think sometimes it's better to hold true to the values and to the international legal obligations which the UK has itself undertaken, because ultimately that's the bottom line. If the Refugee Convention goes, territorial asylum is gone with it.
Thank you, Zoe. I think that's really, really helpful and very clear and on point. We've got 1 minute, so if there's a last question from anyone, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat.
Il y en a une dans le chat, je crois, Francesca.
I think there's one in the chat. It's an important question.
Thank you. Question from Mita, which I'm going to read out. It's a question for Shira. In the UK, because of the hostile environment and the criminalization of migrants, it can be dangerous for people without documentation to participate in mobilizations, etc. Do you have any practical tips on how organisers can better protect people with insecure immigration status so they can participate in the resistance? And agree, that's a really important question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, if we talk about our own collective, when we try to mobilize our comrades in our country, we try to go to, for example, areas where these individuals are being accommodated, and we say we can't be better protected and if we don't actually belong to a collective. So we try to really reinforce the value of having a collective mobilization. So we actually take on that responsibility as a collective, and we create a protective environment for these individuals. So we actually incorporate these individuals within our association. We also work to try to defend individuals, for example, on the borders, at the airports. So we actually used our volunteers to support us. Whenever we feel that there's an issue, a possible issue, we try to actually make sure that when we're organizing these events, we look at the area involved, when we have in volunteer lawyers that we use, and we have their phone numbers always available to individuals. We distribute these phone numbers and we say, right, we're going to make sure that you have a number to call if you have difficulties, particularly within the legal arena. This is our strategy to try to really protect the people demonstrating with us to the maximum. The big argument is that we don't want to see people isolated. We want to encourage them to join a collective to be protected. That's our argument. Thank you. I hope I answered the question there.
Thank you. That's so helpful, and also just a really strong message as well, to always stay together as a collective. And sorry, last question, which I missed, and I appreciate that we're 2 minutes over, but I wonder if the panelists would be okay with staying on for this last question. And the question is, would it be possible to elaborate on how the bill in France and the UK respond to each other? For instance, does the Rwanda agreement influence France looking to close deals with so-called, quote, safe third countries in the global south?
Je sais pas qui peut
I don't know who was meant to answer. Maybe Zoe might be a better place, but just in terms of my own idea, I think when we look at the context in the two countries, I'm sorry we didn't speak so much about Belgium today. When we're looking at the France and UK context, I think both contexts see a lot of pressure, a lot of tension. I don't know if we can talk about, well, I might be wrong, but I don't think we can talk about the fact that these two bills really are responding to each other. I think they're following the same kind of logic of criminalization, of dissuasion, and they are based on similar principles in terms of we're creating a kind of fear of a pseudo invasion in inverted commas and closing the borders, but we see that all the different tools that are being proposed aren't working or won't work, and we can perhaps make that kind of comparison, but I don't know if we can talk about an interaction between the two. Perhaps another panelist might be able to talk about this, but if we look at perhaps some of the agreements on an international level, for example, the one that was also associated with Denmark, I think France is trying to externalize or subcontract a bit like the UK. I think it's something we can reflect upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Zoe?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Anna has said. I don't think that necessarily it's the case that either parliament is watching and borrowing from what the other parliament has done. As I was saying, some of the things proposed in the French bill are things that have been in our legal system, in legislation or in policy for a great number of years through the hostile environment. But I do think that the outcome ultimately of the Rwanda litigation in relation to the third country removals agreement with Rwanda might be of a great deal of interest to our neighbours on the continent. It's not just Denmark, it's also the Netherlands. You know, the Dutch Parliament was thinking of looking at refugee centres outside the EU. And so I think what happens here might set a very bad precedent for the rest of Europe. And as we say, if we abrogate our international obligations under the Refugee Convention, others could follow suit.
Thank you, Zoe. Right, we're now 5 minutes over our time, and I don't want to take up any more of everyone's time. I know it's a really, really busy time period at the moment for everyone, as we've discussed. But please do follow the Cross-Border Forum on Twitter, and you can keep up to date on our work and other future public events through there. And if you are interested in joining the Cross-Border Forum, if you're an organisation that works in the UK, France or Belgium and has an interest in cross-border issues, feel free to get in touch and we can talk about that. I'd just like to end by thanking our fantastic panelists for today, who really were really, really excellent. And also a huge round of applause and thank you for the 2 interpreters today who made sure that everyone could speak and understand everything as clearly as possible. Thank you so much to Sarah and Magali.